Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. Just making this video as a sort of like an introduction to an ongoing series of videos that I have been considering to make in the near future. If you've seen in some of my previous videos, I'm thinking of the video called The Third Force, which I made about a year ago, I do believe, and also the second episode of my podcast, Dreaming in Symbols, where I had Wayman 29, Path of Abraham, and Farhan Qureshi on as guests. And, you know, I've been talking about this idea of sort of a third perspective, or a perspective that's a non-literal approach to Scripture. And, you know, I found that I really appeal to the non-literal approach to Scripture, or what I might call the deeper approach, or the psycho-spiritual approach, mainly championed by mystics of every religion, people like Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, because it jives more with me personally, and I feel that avoiding literalism, you essentially don't fall into the trap of using your scripture to, you know, apply outdated forms of ethics, such as literally applying certain laws that you might find in certain scriptures that I think many of us here in the 21st century would probably disagree with. You also avoid clashing with what we know to be true from science. If you are, and so instead of picking up the Bible or the Qur'an and saying, okay, yes, you know, this is exactly how these things are in the objective, quantitative, real world, if you don't take the literal approach, you essentially avoid these types of errors, as I would say. Now, I focus primarily on the reading of Scripture. Well, in taking part in that second episode of the podcast, I was reminded by Wayman 29, Path of Abraham, and also Farhan, based on what we were talking about, which is, I think that this is a broader subject than just talking about how one approaches Scripture. So, for an example, just because you are in I would say the second camp, which is the sort of traditional religious perspective. This is typically on people who they read their scripture and they think for certain, they have faith that for certain the scripture is talking about objective metaphysical reality without question. And later in this video, I will explain how each one of these camps is in a spectrum as far as I see it. But I was reminded by Wayman 29 in particular that there is a spectrum within the third camp, the symbolic camp, wherein you have the danger of individuals, and this is a healthy criticism, I would say, the danger of individuals who don't take Scripture literally, but they take it so symbolically and so metaphorically that they can basically make anything symbolic, right? So you kind of have this random, Wild West type of subjective reading of Scripture, which isn't really grounded in any sort of tradition or a system by which you use as a lens to look at Scripture. This is something that I brought up in my Sam Harris videos and blog posts, wherein Sam Harris criticized Joseph Campbell for having this kind of radical individual subjective interpretation. Now, there may be individuals who do feel that way, who do approach Scripture in that fashion. They just pick it up and they read it. I would say that there's a difference between that, meaning devotional reading, and actual, like, a system by which, a foundation, a tradition by which you understand things subjectively or metaphorically, symbolically, if you will, non-literally, being the most important thing. So that was the first thing that came to mind. The second thing that came to mind was when Path of Abraham was on the show, and I was reminded of the fact that you can be in the second camp. You can essentially be a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, or a Hindu, and read the Bhagavad Gita or the Bible, and actually think that it is describing things that have actually happened, but there's still the nuance of having, like, the layers of interpretation. So there have been throughout history traditional Jews, Christians, and Muslims who have said that yes, Scripture can be read literally, and I thought it was interesting because Path of Abraham mentioned that my takeaway from talking to him was a literal reading might just be a historical cultural reading. So if you want to know what Scripture is referring to in history, you're reading that from the literal text itself. You're getting that from the manifest text if you want to understand culture and history that it's being discussed in the Scripture. But especially in Judaism, there's 3 other layers. There's deeper layers until you get all the way down to the 4th, which is the mystical reading of the text itself. So I think weighing these 2 things in mind, you have a spectrum here. Because in the second camp, the more traditional religious camp, you might actually have someone that just ignores the 3 other layers of Scripture and only looks at the literal application of Scripture. They may approach religion fundamentally from a dogmatic perspective, whereas you might have other individuals that understand the nuance of the religion, the tradition, which includes hermeneutics of Scripture, and they won't fall into a rigid, dogmatic, doctrinal approach to faith. So, I also, in reading Sam Harris, I was reminded that even over in the first camp, the reductionist camp, or what we might say the materialistic skeptical camp, you're going to have a variety in there too. I would say that there's a pretty big difference between Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins and their respective approach to religion. They may all agree that they are atheists, or Hitchens was an atheist, but really I think Sam Harris, as a great example, is that he does think that there's something to spirituality. He thinks there's something to meditation, to the subjective experience, but he won't apply that in a metaphysical context. He won't say, okay, so I've had a spiritual experience or a meditative experience, a contemplative experience, but I'm not going to equate that to a higher power or to an organized religion. I think that that shows that there is a variation within the first camp. So this has made me rethink my entire approach to talking about the subject of these 3 major differences in the approach and study of religion. Now, one thing I'll probably do in a subsequent blog post is I'm going to actually analyze this particular topic from the perspective of personality types. And to help me with that, I'm going to be citing Carl Jung's Psychological Types, his book that he wrote on the subject, and I'll probably be quoting from this book in the blog posts. So it'll probably be something like personality types in their approach to religion or to objective or subjective proofs. Because that brings me to another point. I was really fascinated by a video that was shared on Twitter by the Rationalizer, and I had a chance to kind of trade some words with him via Twitter. He had posted a video which was a snippet of a longer video from, I think, an old Jinn And Tonic Show episode where Hamza Zortzis was a guest, and they were talking about science and religion, and this was a clip from this longer Jinn And Tonic episode. I think the clip was only like maybe 8 minutes long, and it essentially showed, it would show like Hamza Zortzis versus critical thinking, and it would show a clip from the video where different panelists were talking to Hamza Zortzis on the Jinn And Tonic Show. And as I was watching it, it really made me think of this topic. When we're talking about reality, when we're talking about metaphysics, when we're talking about science, what type of proofs do we usually look for when we're talking about any given topic, and how do those proofs therefore define our opinions based on these various subjects? What I mean by that is, it is very evident to me that you can divide the concept of proofs into 2 categories, objective and subjective. Objective typically takes a more quantitative approach. So this is, you're getting raw data, you're usually submitting it to some sort of form of analysis, and via experiments or surveys, etc., something in the lab, and then you get your results, and you base your understanding of the concept or the hypothesis based on the results. This is something that is used in the hard sciences. It's something that's used in the social sciences. This is something that creates objective understanding. This is something where everyone can read a research article of this nature and say, okay, this is an objective phenomena. This is a quantitative phenomena. And this is something that it doesn't matter whether you are a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, a Buddhist, an atheist, an agnostic. You're going to read that type of research literature, and you can walk away from it saying, this is something we can all agree on because it's objective and it's quantitative. In other words, you can reproduce it by doing the same experiments over and over again. Even if there is doubt, you can formulate a different experiment to challenge the older results. It certainly calls for, you know, admitting your limitations and what you could do to improve it, because it's very rare, at least in my field of when I majored in psychology as an undergrad, in particular, it was very rare when it came to cognitive, developmental psychology, physiological psychology, biological psychology, even social psychology, to have someone say, that's the end, my experiment proves the whole thing, right? It calls for further research. And so I think it is good to keep that in mind. Now, we also have a second type of proof, which is qualitative, subjective proof. This is something that is not something that can be totally studied in a lab. Of course, neuroscience is breaking new grounds in this regard, but this is more of an interest in a subjective experience. So in my own field of psychotherapy, for an example, being a grad student myself, the qualitative is very important because case studies, for an example. So if you want to understand someone's subjective experience, you might formulate a case study to understand their qualitative or their the subjective experience that they are going through, and then you can make inferences, or you can see if a theory is panning out based on a psychotherapeutic theory, for example, is panning out from the subjective experience. I would also say that spirituality, studying some forms of religious experience and mysticism, is usually highly subjective. This is something that is only within the realm of the individual, and you're studying cases of individuals, collecting that particular data of all the individual documentation of experiences, and then going from there. Having said that, one thing that I honestly think, and this is now formulating my own opinion, is that there's a problem when someone tries to take something that's subjective and qualitative and tries to then invade a quantitative or an objective arena. This is the problem that I saw with the video, that the Jinn And Tonic Show clip. I could see that Hamza Zortzis, no doubt because of IERA, Mission Dawa, the London Dawa page, you know, all these are all connected, these YouTube channels, their organization, IERA. I would argue that at least recently, their largest target, and maybe that's just because the largest, the loudest and most vocal opponents of theirs have been atheists in particular, that it seems that IERA is really fascinated in trying to convince atheists of the truths of Islam. And they know that atheists, not all atheists, but they know that many atheists fall into the first camp, the sort of reductionist materialist camp, and that they want to argue with the ones that are very much, they get their world, not even worldview, because some of them may not even consider a worldview, but for them to understand reality, they favor objective, quantitative proofs. So to meet that challenge, if you will, Hamza Zortzis and other religious apologists, because not just Muslim apologists, to be fair, I mean, there's plenty of Christian apologists that do this too, who attempt to take objective data, such as science, as the Jinn And Tonic Show video clip clearly indicated, and they attempt to basically use science to prove a subjective concept, i.e., the experience of God, the existence of God. Okay, so this is destined to fail. Now, my bias is I do consider myself a member of this third camp, the more symbolic camp. And what do I mean by this third camp for me in particular? Well, what I mean by it is that this third camp typically is more concerned with basically the third approach is a psycho-spiritual approach, and for me that includes Kantian, critical theism / spirituality, so Kantian approach of philosophy. More concerned with the subjective qualitative proofs. Mysticism, psychology, experience is the highlight. Metaphysics are purely theoretical. So I do follow Kant and Carl Jung in this regard, and even Joseph Campbell, that you could have a metaphysical opinion about something, but you have to understand that it's purely theoretical. I may have had experiences that, in my intuition, for example, may inform me that consciousness may continue on into after death, for an example. But I've never had a near-death experience, nor have I personally ever experienced heaven or hell or, Hades or any of the stated recorded afterlife versions. So can I say for sure, for certain, that these things really do exist? Personally, no. So therefore, if I have a subjective metaphysical idea, it's an idea, it's a theory, and certainly I would not feel comfortable trying to convince someone else to join me in this endeavor, to actually agree with me on any of the metaphysical ideas that I may or may not be engaging with. So, however, the subjective spiritual experience is actually the main focus in this third particular camp. We can't be dogmatic about the transcendent because we cannot claim to know for certain about the metaphysical ideas. So that's something that I just want to highlight here. In future videos, I'm going to break down this third camp based on my understanding of it. I'll do a video, no doubt, about philosophy. I'll talk about the Kantian approach to religion. I'll be talking about the perennial philosophy as written by Aldous Huxley and also by Houston Smith. I'll be talking about psychology, Carl Jung's approach to religion. Also Joseph Campbell, the mythological approach to religion. Erich Fromm, the psychoanalytical perspective. Probably toss in some Freud as well. When it comes to metaphysics, I'll be talking about Swedenborg and Kant, study of mysticism comparatively, because it's mainly a psychological approach, William James and Evelyn Underhill. So those are the things that I'll probably be doing in the near future to sort of unpack this, because the third approach really does bring in these elements of philosophy, psychology, and mysticism or spirituality into the mix. So this is sort of a teaser for future videos where I'll be carrying on the sort of line of thought. But I just want to make it very clear that when I watch a video like this, when it comes to talking about metaphysical claims, again, I just don't have the absolute certainty that I think Hamza Zortzis is trying to admit. It baffles me now because, when I used to be a Muslim apologist, I certainly did, do the very cheesy quoting of, Dr. Zakir Naik about, the science in the Qur'an and the supposed science in the Qur'an. And, I used to have these debates with people that I knew in person and also probably online, I don't remember, but certainly in person we're having a lot of very vivid, vivid memories of having debates with people about, the Qur'an's true because, it's got scientific claims in it. And just in realizing now in retrospect how ridiculous that type of debate really is. As the video clip, as the Jinn And Tonic Show clearly demonstrated, there's a real problem with doing this type of apologetics, because you are therefore you're therefore saying that a huge part of the reason why you believe in a certain text is because it's talking about science. And I just think that is to reduce any scripture to be talking about objective reality in the context of scientific claims is just a very slippery slope to be on. I truly do think that. So, for example, when Hamza Zortzis, when he's cornered about the Noah and the flood, which I personally, my own systems of spirituality and belief, I don't even take the flood story personally. I don't take it literally at all. In fact, I don't. It's a myth. It's a myth with psychological meaning and spiritual meaning, but I would not try and argue that it actually happened. Hamza Zortzis basically resorts to saying, oh, what's an ontological thing? Well, Kant certainly challenged the ontological argument, and so when I heard that, I just kind of went, well, all right. And one of the panelists said, well, you know, you just have to get over it. Hamza believes in magic, and the atheist panelist does not. Yeah, I just think that it is a very ridiculous thing to try and prove to someone metaphysical claims. Because no matter what you do, unless you're with a group of people, you're with a group of, 200 people, if you say, and you all have the same objective experience, the same exact experience, for sure, the angel comes down and says, all right, here's your proof, everybody. No matter what, spiritual or metaphysical claims are designated to the subjective experience. And being subjective by nature, I cannot then take any of my own subjective experiences or any of my metaphysical theorizing and attempt to say to another person, this is why you should believe what I believe. We can talk about common experiences. I've certainly met many people, atheist, theist, polytheist, whatever, who have said, oh yeah, I've had something that's like a spiritual experience, or I've had an experience when I'm meditating, or having a contemplative experience. Those are things that we can talk about as a shared experience. We have that in common, but you'll notice that every single person will interpret that experience differently. They may just say, yeah, okay, I had a meditative experience, so my breathing, and they may reduce it, kind of like what Sam Harris does, will reduce it to a sort of a physiological experience. I may attribute it to a spiritual thing. That I may do, but I would not dare then to say to Sam Harris, for example, you're right and I'm wrong. Subjective opinions have to be considered as such. They're opinions. They may give meaning and value to the person who experiences it. And this is something that I had mentioned to the rationalizer. I said, I've had experiences which I've liked, and as such, no one can take that subjective experience away from me. But I would not commit the fallacy that I believe that Hamza Zortzis and other typical religious apologists, dogmatic or doctrinal religious individuals would do, which is attempt to then take religion, shove it into the scientific, objective, quantitative realm, and then try and make arguments based on that. Mainly to convince people who base many of their views on things on objective quantitative data. I just think that that is a terrible idea. As the Jinn And Tonic Show clip clearly demonstrated, in my opinion. So, yeah, it's just funny, because when I watch many of these videos, and I'll just end with this, when I watch these types of videos, I find myself, even though I'm not an atheist myself, I just kind of shake my head and just go, these traditional religious folks, these doctrinal, dogmatic, whatever you want to call them, religious folks, wherever they are on that spectrum, in that second group, who think that, okay, I for sure I read this text, and yes, for sure this is pointing to a metaphysical claim, and therefore I'm going to prove it to other people because my doctrine says this, that, and the other. I'm just amazed how when I watch these types of videos, I agree more with the skeptics than I do with the religious folks. So those are my thoughts on this particular subject, everyone. Thank you all for watching, and also just a heads up, as I pull out my calendar here, the next Dreaming in Symbols podcast is scheduled for Saturday the 22nd at 4:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll have Farhan Qureshi as my guest for that particular episode. He and I will be talking about apostasy and conversion to and from Islam, and just the sort of the spiritual and psychological implications of that particular topic. That will be followed by the next episode will be the 29th of August, which is again a Saturday, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, or sorry, 4:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. My guest will be Klingshore, and he and I will be discussing the study of Hadith criticism, transmission, compilation, and debate therein. So we'll be looking at Muslim and non-Muslim approaches to the study of the Hadith. So that's it for now. Thank you all for watching. Peace be with you all.